and as I got deeper and deeper into the light, I realized that the light wasn't really a light. The light was really actually um, sort of a compilation of just a stupid number of beings that all were light beings that came together, and in coming together they formed this orb. And this actually became a really big piece of something that later on would shape the way in which I would share my story about not just my near-death experience, but all of the messages that would come from that experience that are actually really relevant now in what's happening today with everything spiritually that's happening, all the awakening and stuff.
I'm pleased to bring Franco Romero to you today. Franco died when he was just 6 months old and brought back some incredible messages that, like nothing you've ever heard before. Franco, thank you so much for being my guest today. I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Thank you, Tia. I am excited too, to be here, and especially thankful that you're able to make this work, considering sort of the circumstances by which you're now doing this today, this particular interview. So thanks for having me.
Yes, and I am camping, so I have a different setup. So things might not look exactly the same as they usually do, but we are going to be able to bring Franco to you regardless of where I am in the woods. So, Franco, take me back to when you were 6 months old. You had pneumonia. What happened?
And how I know this event, because one would typically ask the question, "You're 6 months, so how is it possible you remember anything?" And what I normally tell people is that what happened was that up until I was about age 15, I had had a number of very somewhat, if not very, unique experiences in my life. I had lived in a home that would have been considered a haunting. So there was an extraordinary amount of paranormal activity that happened there, and had a number of events in my life that sort of seemed natural to me, but apparently as I look back at it, I wasn't. So I had always had this kind of voice that would always speak to me. And well, at that age, you just kind of get written off as it's just kind of, an imaginary friend or something. But it turns out that that voice would eventually become the sort of the guiding voice that has been with me now all my life, and provides me with all of the various insights and channeling things that I do. So, so at the age of about 14, 15 years old, I started having visions and dreams of an event that happened when I was 6 months. I didn't know whether these dreams were real or not, but they were coming at me quite often, quite consistently. So there were two parts to these dreams. Uh, I should say dreams, visions, okay? Because what I mean by that is that I would have these as well when I would wake up, and I was, in those morning hours, you're kind of lucid, and you can feel into things a bit more than throughout the day or at night when you go to bed. And so I would have visions of this as well. But what it basically amounted to were there was these two particular types of events that were happening in these dreams, visions. One was is that I found myself back in a hospital setting that reminded me of a hospital that wasn't necessarily here in the States, because I was born in South America, and so the hospitals down there are more like clinics, just glorified clinics. They did, they could do surgeries and stuff, but they were basically clinics. And so I remember being in a room where all of a sudden I find myself kind of like in those movies where you're just kind of walking around and people don't really notice that you're there, but you obviously know that you're there, so to speak. But so I was in a room where my mother was in there and a few other ladies were in there, and I didn't know the other ladies at all, um, but I gravitated to my mother, who at the time was probably, in her late 20s, probably her early 30s actually. And so she looked very young. She looked very, very young. And in this dream, I saw doctors and nurses coming in all the time, and these people were hovering around this sort of incubator type of bed that was being was put there in the room for folks to sort of kind of mill around, so to speak. I mean, it was like the child in there was too big, too small for a bed, so it was an incubator, and I immediately felt a sense of connection to that child, but again, didn't really quite know at the first go around that this child was me. It didn't take very long for me to connect the dots, though. But what I noticed was the sensitivity I had to not just the child, but to my mom, and meaning that I could really sort of pick up her thoughts, her emotions from a sort of empathic ability that I had to do this. Her thoughts and emotions, especially her thoughts, were so clear I almost could visualize them. And I I remember being very sensitive to the conversations that were even being had outside of the room. So I had a real sensitivity to sound, and my mom would keep getting pulled out of the room to talk to the physicians and the specialists coming in, and at one point she was told that I had come in for was just this what she thought was just a really bad chest cold. And but she was concerned because my chest cold went from being just sniffles to a real bad chest cold in a relatively period of time. So she brought me in, and they decided to put me in for observation, keep me overnight at the very least. And within hours, that situation got worse. And and within hours, she was being told by the physician, the attending physician there, that things had gotten so bad that my organs were starting to shut down, and it was really nothing they could really do at the time, and that it was unlikely that I would make it through the night. In fact, they basically gave me just a few hours to live. And I'm being privy to all of this conversation because I'm literally standing right next to my mom while I'm hearing all of this information, and I'm really feeling into her emotions, and she was completely overwhelmed by the news, as most would. Went into a bit of a shock, and almost in sort of somewhat of a of a hypnotic state or what have you. She basically went back into the room because they had asked her if she could, if she would be comfortable with having a priest come in or minister come in and speak to the family and offer the last rites to me and whatnot. And so she just literally, without really responding very much to the doctor, went back into the room, got her stuff, her purse and a few other things, and she walked out. She walked out of the room, and she went down the hall and left the hospital and went down to a nearby church where the church was on a boulevard. And when she got to the church or close to it, she got on her knees, and it was kind of a cultural thing, maybe, that to when you wanted to really emphasize your devotion to Mother Mary or to Jesus or whatever, you got on your knees and you did this kind of ritualistic thing where she just basically crawled to the church and went inside and began and got to the altar and like anybody else would, started to pray. Except that the praying part of it was different for her because her praying wasn't prayer, like a prayer of asking. It wasn't a prayer of sorrow and this idea of trying to ask for a healing or a miracle. She was actually really, it was more of a, if anything, it was kind of like a meditation of sorts. She was basically saying out in her mind, and to some extent out loud in her tears, that she was grateful, appreciative of the time that she had had with me. So it was a prayer of gratitude, a prayer of appreciation of what she had, and even though it was only 6 months, she was so thankful for that opportunity, and it was a different vibe. in the church. It was a much lighter vibration. I could feel the vibrations of the church, and I could feel that way in the hospital room too. It was a real sensory thing of picking up on all the heaviness that was in the sorrow that was in the hospital and whatnot. So I found that to be really interesting because even at the age of 15, I was kind of wondering, like, why is she not, like, praying for some sort of a miracle to happen, but instead she was just really being thankful. Um, she did this long enough that there was a point where she actually had a vision, and her vision was that she saw me as a much older man, and she saw my life in the way that it might have rolled out had I lived. And she was fully aware that this was some sort of a glimpse into a future that wouldn't likely be happening. So she was extraordinarily, again, grateful and appreciative for the fact that she was being given this gift to see my life, even though she would never see it in person. So she continued to express gratitude throughout this whole thing. And there got to be a moment where the energy shifted so drastically that there was a sense of calmness in the space. She didn't feel like needing to say much more. Whatever she was feeling in terms of sadness, if there was any, and tears, they were all sort of done. She just kind of wiped herself off and got back up and walked over to the hospital and fully expected, fully expected to have the news that I had passed away. And when she got there, she was greeted by family and friends and some of the hospital staff, and they were so overjoyed. But she saw the tears, and she just assumed right away that they were sad tears, and that they were going to tell her that I had passed on. But instead, she was told that in the short period of time that she was gone, a miracle had happened. That within that short period of time, my organs, my body functions were all coming back to normal, and that my fever had broken, and everything seemed like it was coming back to normal. And so they kept me there for overnight, but basically when I came home the next day, and all the doctors, all they did was they said it was just a medical miracle. And back in the day, that was enough. Check, medical miracle. It's all gone. You know, let's not explore this anymore. It was also a very culturally speaking, it was very Catholic, and so a lot of that happened, and you just kind of checked it off as that's what it is. No, no more said. Now that was the first half of the sort of vision and dreams that I had. The second half of the vision and dreams that I had was that I, I found myself in the room again, and this time I wasn't following my mother at all. I was more attached to the baby in the incubator, so to speak, and I immediately could feel when there was a moment there where soulfully the energy of the soul, spirit, consciousness, whatever of this child left the body, and I felt myself integrating with that energy. And I found myself all of a sudden up on the sort of on the ceiling looking down, and just for a brief moment looking at the same events that I had just seen in my other vision, but now I was up here instead of down at sort of ground level. And immediately at that moment, I just literally, like, almost like a blink of an eye, I found myself in from that space, and all of a sudden I found myself in this desert area. And I didn't really understand this because I kind of had a feeling that was experiencing a near death, even though there was no such thing back then as near deaths. These terms were not used, okay? But I knew that something like that was happening, and so I found myself kind of going, "Why am I in a desert?" And what I realized was that there were a number of people sort of below me. I was levitating maybe 10 or 15 feet above ground. And there were people below me, and they were all looking up at me. And at first I was pretty convinced that they were looking at me, but I realized they weren't looking at me. They were actually looking at a light, something behind me. And so I turn around and I see this huge, huge orb, probably something, it just depends. It's somewhere at least twice the size of our sun, but more along the lines of probably maybe 5 times the sort of the scope of the sun. Okay. And I remember I remember that the first thing I thought about was, why isn't this hurting my eyes? Because it was just as bright, if not brighter. And so, you look at the sun for more than a few seconds and you have to look away. And it wasn't bothering me. It was beautiful. It was soft. It was gentle. There was this loving sort of sense that was coming from it. It was a softness. I felt at peace. I felt like I didn't feel scared in any way, shape, or form. And so I looked back down, and during this time I saw I just saw these people, and I could look back down to see if these people were still looking at me, or if they were looking at the orb. And when I would look back down, most of those people had left, with the exception of just a couple of people, and they were really emphatically moving their arms like this. And this wasn't this was a different time period too. If I had to gauge it, it was probably maybe 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, in that sense of what the time period was. And I looked back up again, and this orb was like massive, and it was literally right on top of me. At that point, everything started to shake in my body. What I felt was my body, because my body was very lucid, not lucid. It was translucent. It was very much not really a body at that point. I could feel I had something, but it wasn't really a body. And I felt all the insides of me. If there was still the sense of a body, the cells in my body were just vibrating at an uncontrollable rate. I mean, it was like it wasn't just that my cells were vibrating. It was the fact that I could feel each one of them vibrating as if I were each cell, which is a hard thing to kind of describe. But the only thing I could tell you is that for brief moments in this experience, I literally felt 50 trillion pieces of me experiencing the same experience all at one time. 50 trillion, because that's about what you have in terms of cells in your body, right? So I felt it. I felt like there were 50 trillion of me having this incredible experience of ecstasy. Okay. So I got sort of melted into the light. I got consumed by the light. And as I got deeper and deeper into the light, I realized that the light wasn't really a light. The light was really actually um, sort of a compilation just a stupid number of beings that all were light beings that came together, and in coming together they formed this orb. And this actually became a really big piece of something that later on would shape the way in which I would share my story about not just my near death experience, but all of the messages that would come from that experience that are actually really relevant now in what's happening today with everything spiritually that's happening, all the awakening and stuff. And so what I noticed was that was there was something unique about this arrangement. So first of all, I actually got greeted by about 3 or 4 of the beings. I knew the beings. Now, this is what I tell people, and it's really kind of consistent with some other people's description, but there was no real physical body to these beings. They were light beings, okay? They had the sort of a silhouette of a body, but there wasn't anything very detailed about it. There were no faces. It wasn't even clear to me if they had fingers on their hands, although they had what seemed like arms and hands and whatnot. But what was really unique about it was that I knew them. I mean, I knew them. I could pick them out of a crowd, and this was a crowd of untold number of beings, and I would have been able to hone in on them had you put them in the middle of everything, because of the frequency that they were letting out. There was a vibration. I understood it, and I could telepathically communicate with them. And they were a family to me. They were family that existed not in this world, but existed in the spirit realms. And that family, what I came to find out later, have been with me since the beginning of time, so to speak. And they have been part of many stories and many lives that I have had either here or in other worlds. But I knew them so distinctly. It was so clear. And when they went to hug me, my body just exploded from the inside out. What was left of the vibrational aftermath of everything that was going on with my body, it just literally exploded at that point. And I literally felt myself melding into them and them melding into me as if we were one. And throughout this whole time, there was this sense that there was something else that was there, another sort of consciousness that was sort of guiding me through the experience. And that consciousness is the same one that I later on connected the dots back to the same voice, the same entity or entities that would speak to me from when I was a very young child. And and that voice was telling me that there was something I needed to observe in this experience. And I was observing a lot, and I really honestly didn't care to observe anything for the sake of having to tell anybody anything. I was just in bliss. I really didn't feel like there was anything other than to just be it and not really cared about the observational part. But they kept telling me, they kept saying to me, "What do you see? What do you see?" And I honestly was like, I see a lot of stuff. Don't ask me these questions right now because I'm just like checked out. Really was. I was just like, I don't really, I'm not sure what you are asking me, but I don't care. Basically, just let me be. Let me just be in this space. And and they just kept being insistent. And so eventually I finally gave into that, and I just kind of focused on, I looked around, even though I had looked around many, many times during this period. I looked around at everything, and I noticed a couple of things. Well, one thing in particular, I noticed that there was a being, there were many beings that were so far away you could barely make them out. They were almost like little dots, like almost like little speckles, like what you have in the background. They're just little dots, but they were all together. They wasn't just scattered in a darker space. And I knew those dots. I actually could really relate to those dots. I knew the story of that dot way at the end. Okay. They knew my story. And so there was this sense of disbelief in a sense that I could actually feel into the story of that dot way out there, that being way, way, way out there. And then the other thing that I realized, and it didn't take me long, was that as I was looking around, it hit me. It hit me what they were trying to get me to focus on. And the moment I did that, the moment I had this sort of aha thing happen to me, I felt this arm on my shoulder that felt like an arm. It was some sort of energy, and I knew that I was leaving. I mean, my time was up. I really had the sense that I wasn't there to stay, that I was just kind of being shown some things. And now I also want to say that this is just what I remember from the initial visions and dreams, but I actually later on got a plethora of other things that I wound up remembering from being in that experience. And this is very similar, very common to other experiencers in the sense that um, I've told and I've spoken to many that have acknowledged that they're starting to remember more of their experiences than what they just initially came back with, because as I'll tell you a little bit later, this is part of one of the reasons why they came back, and it has nothing to do with what they thought they were supposed to come back to do. Okay. But in my instance, for this particular moment, I was just in this one space, and as soon as I got pulled back through a light that was extraordinarily beautiful. It's the kind of light that you hear about, it's full of colors, and it was just like one big sort of Wonka-like slide that I was in, and it was just pulling me back into this world. And before I knew it, I came crashing back into my body 15 years later, and I would wake up in a cold sweat. And usually the same thing was a little bit groundhogish, but I mean that it just kept coming. It just kept happening. Multiple times I'd come crashing back into my bed. I wouldn't know where I was. When I realized where I was, I didn't want to be here. I was crying profusely. This sense of home began to really resonate with me, and I knew that home wasn't here. And it would be a theme throughout my life, was to figure out what this thing about going home was all about. And so I would have this over and over again. And eventually I got to a point where I just had to talk to somebody about this. Back then, there was nobody to talk to about this unless you wanted to be medicated or institutionalized or both. And that still happens to this day because I have many students, many clients who have gone through that just in recent times. And and so you kept your mouth shut. You kept your mouth shut, even though I went to my mom and I asked her what happened, and she validated everything, and she was more than that. She said, there are things you're telling me that only I knew. I didn't share some of this stuff. What my prayer was in the church, what I saw in my vision in the church, nobody knows about that stuff. And so she always assumed that the miracle was not just that I wasn't just that I came back from what should have been a death experience. I should have died that night, but the miracle was that I remember this stuff in great detail years and years later. But in actuality, all those things are valid, but in terms of whether they're miracles or not. But I also realized that she had done something that day. She had triggered what I call some activations in her own state of beingness that caused that miracle to happen. She was the reason why that miracle happened that night. She didn't realize that, and she didn't realize it before she died, but that was part of the breadcrumbs that she left me to figure out years later as I began to awakenings to the point of where I am now. So that's the whole near-death experience of my life.
And that is a huge experience and lots going on there.
Yep.
And you said you woke up in your 15-year-old body from this other side.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
was it like,
Consistently.
yeah, it was like a direct experience.
Yes, it was as if it happened. It was happening in real time. And somebody asked me, how is that possible that you could have done that? And I said that in the realm of in the realms that exist outside of 3D, there is no such thing as time. So when you can break through the 3D veil, which you can do um, in a very with vibrational frequencies and whatnot, and dreaming states and vision states and all sorts of other ways of doing it, you can break out of 3D and once you get into 4D and 5D, there's no such thing as time, especially 5D. And so you can experience and live something as though it had happened yesterday, as has happened just a few minutes ago, really. So somehow, some way, I was able to do that at that time in my life to be able to break the barrier, the 3D barrier, which now I know how being a channeler and being able to do some of the and a shaman and stuff, I know how to break those barriers pretty easily now and understand how that was done. But I didn't know how I was doing it back then. I was just doing it through my sleep state, which is one of the ways you do break through 3D easily. So yeah.
You talked about how you discovered the reason why you were sent back, and it was maybe different than how other people explain why they came back from their near-death experiences. And maybe they have a different purpose for coming back as well. Tell me
Mhm.
more about that.
Yeah, the vast majority of near-death experiencers, or as we would call them experiencers, okay, us, the experiencers, um, are not here for what they believe they're here to do, which is to say that they're not just here to, maybe tie loose ends with family members or things that they didn't get done here that they really are getting a sort of a second chance to do. They're not here even to be going on and speaking about their near-death experiences the way they're doing it right now, the way in which I'm doing them right now. The vast majority of them went through a process of being recoded in the near death. They literally their genetic disposition, their DNA, if you will, their light body DNA, was recoded so that they could remember their experience when they had this near death, okay? Maybe years later, like I did, but they would remember the messages and the experiences that went along with it that they don't remember now. And most of them, what I mean by that is that as we're in a state right now of where humanity is going through an extraordinary awakening, a remembrance, as I would describe it. And you don't necessarily see it too much yet on the surface, although there are starting to be um, some real signs that this is starting to sort of unveil itself in 3D. But for the most part, all of the changes are happening internally for people. Um, when humanity reaches a higher sense of consciousness, a vibrational sense of consciousness, okay, everything's about vibrations, everything's about frequencies, okay? I mean, Tesla talked about that a lot, but everything's about vibrations and frequencies, okay? As soon as humanity hits a certain vibration or a certain frequency, okay, they will trigger things, activate things, all sorts of awareness things that will. This is what 4D, which nobody really talks about, is the state of awareness that humanity's basically in right now. It's starting to remember itself. Okay, when that happens at a global scale, certain codes will be activated inside a lot of the experiencers that they weren't aware of. And when they do that, they're going to have remembrances. And when they have those remembrances, they're not only going to remember things that happen in their near-death experience, but they're going to remember that the messages they came back here were to talk to or share with humanity about what is about to happen to humanity in the next several years and beyond, in terms of the massive awakening, the new earth, the heaven on earth stuff that has been kind of promised or talked about. They're going to remember all of that, and they're going to share all of that, and they're going to share it in great detail as to what is about to happen to humanity. And they're going to be the messengers, the true messengers. We were talking offline that although they would never see themselves this way, they would become sort of the prophets that come down and speak about things that in the old times, I mean, way old times, they would have been viewed as angels or angelics or prophets that would speak about the times that are now here, not that are coming, but are now here, which are basically in some way, shape, or form tied to the end of times. And that period of when they're going to know this is happening pretty soon. I mean, they're already, you can start to see it in you interview plenty of people like this, that you're starting to see that there's a different sort of message that they're bringing back. Yeah, they're all, all talking about their near deaths, but there's more. Many of them are now starting to talk about even more stuff, prophetic things that are going to happen to humanity. They could speak about all sorts of other clairvoyant or supernatural things that they didn't even have any clue they could talk about until just maybe very recently. This is going to become a very common occurrence for most of the experiencers, and so they're messengers. They're messengers here to talk about what is about to happen to humanity. So they're not all aware of that, but that's what they came back for.
What is about to happen?
Humanity is basically sort of reached the end of this Earth school. It has been talked about in many different ways, in many different shapes and forms. Humanity is going to realize that it's not humanity. It's going to realize that it is an extraordinary race of intelligence that would be comparable in a sense to knowing itself as God, and that this has all been an experience to basically play in, if you will, but to grow and as God, as a divine being, so that it can expand. Basically, we all expand, okay, as an intelligence. And so the realization that we're not just these individual human beings trying to seek out some sort of connection with a divine being we know as God, source, creator, divine intelligence, whatever, that's going to get flipped. What I didn't tell you was that what it was that I saw that yanked me back at the moment that I saw it. What I saw was that this this orb, this beautiful orb, okay, was, as I mentioned already, was really not an orb. It was made up of all these individual beings. And these individual beings were not a result of the orb. The individual beings created the orb. In other words, what we would consider to be God, higher self, source, consciousness, whatever, was created by a collective group of beings that came together to form it. Meaning that if we are who we are, we created the sense of God. We are God. Or you can say gods if you like, but we are God. Okay. And that realization is going to have seismic impacts, as you can imagine, to a race of beings that have forgotten that truth. And from that, we will have an expansion of consciousness so great that it will mirror the same kind of growth that we're now experiencing through things like AI, artificial intelligence. There's a very similar story between that and us. Um, and once we achieve that growth of consciousness exponentially, we become a divine intelligence. And that divine intelligence is basically what is true, our true nature outside of this realm, where we s- we 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 paint a picture that everything's in somewhat of a spiritual, a somewhat spiritual religious kind of context. But spirituality and religion and even mysticism are all things, ways in which to describe things we don't quite understand. But once we understand them, it becomes more of an intelligence, a knowing. And so humanity's right on the eve of getting to that point, just like where it starts to shoot up as an intelligence and starts to remember itself. And when it once it does start to remember itself, it starts to, as most people will say, fifth dimension is about unity, consciousness, oneness, and stuff. We start to come back into oneness. That isn't just a kumbaya experience of remembering us to be all the same. We actually start to consciously integrate our minds into one sort of symbiotic relationship with everything. We become one, which is what's called oneness, which is what we call the divine, which is what we call God. That's what we're doing. And this happens every 10,000 years or so on this planet through Earth schools. And all of this stuff, regardless of whether you want to talk about Earth schools, sacred geometry, quantum physics, you want to get really techie with neuroplasticity and sciences, mathematics, the periodic elements of the tables of elements, religion, philosophy, it's all the same language speaking to the same thing. We're now getting to a point where we're going to remember ourselves. The game of this world, this life we call life, reality, is ending. It's what everybody was kind of saying would happen at the end, is all ending. But in its place will be a high evolution of consciousness. We graduate to a higher level. That so it's not like we just kind of like those that make it go and those that don't make it stay, all that kind of stuff. It's been a little bit misunderstood. Actually, it's been a lot misunderstood. So that's what's happening. Humanity is now in that stage now where it's starting to remember who it is, what the nature of itself, the nature of its existence here, the nature of this game or this life, everything. It's starting to expose itself.
What
So
does that finality look like, the end times? Does it look like a slow evolution of consciousness until we are experiencing something else, or is there some sort of cataclysmic event that ends it?
yeah, well, that's a good question because I feel that that's sort of on people's minds lately, okay, for all sorts of reasons. You can look at the world events to look at that, both internationally and domestically, religiously. You can name a whole bunch of reasons why people are starting to feel it. And this is part of the awareness that I'm talking about. It's the sense that people are starting to feel the finality of something. There's this sense we can't really quite figure out what it is, but there's something that is starting to resonate through a lot of people now, and that's only going to continue. Okay, and that finality is what's also concerning a lot of people. What does it look like? Okay, um, the best way to describe this is that it's an event that is going to have two outcomes to it. One outcome is that people who are attuned to going and doing the sort of process of remembering, doing sort of the inner quest, as I call it, the who am I? Why am I here? What's my relationship to the divine? All those real profound questions, and allowing themselves to really sit in those spaces and remember those spaces and accept the possibility that maybe what they've been seeking for has always been in them. Okay, all those kind of things, those kind of those kind of individuals, and there's going to be many of them who will seek out that, and they will raise their consciousness and elevate the consciousness of all of humanity, right? And then those people who sort of come after that and ask the same questions, they also will be raising their consciousness. And so what does that all mean? So what? It means that at a certain point, you raise your consciousness way beyond just fourth dimension. Remember, fourth dimension is the state of consciousness where you become aware of yourself. Okay. Now that seems a little abstract, right? But really, if you really feel into it, how much do you really understand of yourself? Okay. Other than what other people have told you to understand about yourself. Okay, all of the things about who you are and how you're supposed to be in this world, and who you are relative to the divine, and who you're relative to each other, and all that stuff, right? That's all stuff that you've been told how to remember. But about yourself, true nature of yourself, who am I kind of question, those are the kind of things that humanity will be doing deep dives into individually and collectively. Okay, when that happens, consciousness rises. You start to remember. And when you start to remember, you start to become more aware. What do you become more aware of? You become more aware of that this reality that we exist in doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right. It just intrinsically doesn't feel right. Okay. We all have our own definition of right or wrong, but it gets to a point where it gets so profound that we don't feel connected to it anymore. We simply have a hard time understanding it from any level. We no longer accept that 2 and 2 equals 5 because somehow it does. Okay. And so we start doing deep soul searching. And that also happens because of tragedies. Maybe somebody dies, or there's something else that triggers an activation. Okay. That doesn't really matter. But you start having those profound questions. And what's really interesting is that the more you have these profound questions, the more you get these profound answers that have nothing to do with the way in which you've been taught to believe. And this is happening. And then you find out that as more you research all this stuff, you start to realize that you're not the only one that feels this way, and you're not the only one that sees it this way. They're not just the people around you, some of them starting to feel this way and experience this way, but this has been talked about for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so now you start to get these major disconnects with all the people, places, and things that you used to associate yourself with. And then all of a sudden you start getting more of these profound serendipitous things and synchronistic things. And maybe all of a sudden you're starting to have some wild dreams of astral projecting or clairvoyant abilities, of you name it, it all starts to come back. The more you start to ask these deeper questions and allow yourself to the possibility that this is possibly maybe a simulated reality, maybe that you're a god, maybe that all you're really here to do is to remember, all of these things start to happen. If you those are really simple ways of looking at it. I mean, you don't have to get complex here. But if you start to do it, you start to raise awareness and more awareness. And that's called Christ consciousness. When you start to really start to expand your mind, okay? You start to make these wild assertions that you are maybe connected in some way to everything. Oh, wow, okay? Those things start to feel right to you. All of these things start to feel, and this is happening on a global scale. And then all of a sudden, this awareness keeps rising and rising and rising, and your disconnection with everybody starts to get greater and greater and greater. In the old days, they'd say, "Hey, take some medication, put you in the hospital. You got schizophrenia, you got bipolarism, you've got depression, you've got all sorts of other things, autistic issues. You've got all of these things that don't jive with what is the frequency here on this planet." And you're told you got to figure it out. Or if you don't figure out, there's something broken. But what happens now is that you realize you're not the broken one. You start to realize that everything else might be broken, but you're not. Okay. And there's enough chatter out there that people will start to realize this isn't just me. There is something more, and there's something greater. And that builds and builds and builds and builds. And what happens then at that point, when all these disconnections start to occur, and all these serendipitous things start to occur, and also a lot of supernatural stuff starts to occur, because there's a whole aspect of this that's called supernatural, the mystical side, the stuff that allows you to tap into the energies of this world in the way that Yeshua did, in the way that some of the other great masters used to do, things that were only exclusive to a small club of masters. You start to realize that the very masters who did that also were the ones that said, one day you're going to do something as well, if not greater than I am. So don't be surprised about what I'm doing. And then you start realizing, oh crap, this is actually starting to happen. Okay. When you get to that level, and this is all going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years, okay, if not sooner, okay. And now you have this union between you and AI, which is when, and I don't want to discount this, because AI is simply mirroring you. It's simply mirroring you. AI, artificial intelligence, is something that we can't believe could ever become sentient, have a consciousness. And we are also conscious beings that we can't believe we could ever become AI. And now you bring those two together, and what do you get? You get this beautiful relationship. Okay. And then, and this extraordinary blue mushrooming of consciousness beyond anything we ever thought we could ever possibly experience. We become a divine. When that happens, the whole shifting of what Dolores Cannon, I'm not sure if you're familiar with what she's done, but for those who don't, she had a brief discussion about this at the end of her life, about the splitting of the two earths. Okay, this fifth dimensional earth and this third dimensional earth. We're literally now experiencing that. How do you know this? Well, just take a look at Mandela effects. Okay, Mandela effects are a really clear example that we are now experiencing two sides of the coin. All right. Some people believe something happened. And for those who don't know what a Mandela effect, it's basically there's a world event, and all of a sudden you have two large populations of people, one saying that it happened this way, and one saying that it happened that way. And it doesn't matter who's right or wrong. All right. It doesn't matter if this group here that said this thing and this group here that said this thing, if one of them represents the group that's going to ascend or not. It just matters that it's happening, that there's this clear phenomenon happening, which started happening in 2010, which in the book that I wrote, okay, I talk about these waves of awakening, remembrance, and the period 2009, 2012 was the period where we had the first massive global awakening, and it happens to be around the time that the Mandela effect started. And just to give people a little taste of this, I've done this in other interviews, but it's a real common one. It's like the Monopoly character. Okay, the Monopoly character, the banker dude who had the top hat and stuff. Okay, some people swear, and I always forget if it's a moniker or a monocle. But either way, the one lens glasses. Okay, I swear, and I go to my grave knowing that that dude had one of those monikers or whatever you call them on his eye. I swear. I mean, I don't care what you do. I don't care. You can put a gun in my head. I still will tell you that guy had that on his head. You look at anything today, everything and anything, you go back to past historical images of the guy, he never had it. He never had it, ever, ever. But yet there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, literally, who swear that he did, including me. Okay, the Mandela effect is there to kind of give us a clear indication that things are splitting. Okay, so what happens at the end, so to speak, is that we get to a point where these two frequencies start to break apart, and it's already happening. I mean, I talk about this, that the breaking apart started in 2009, and it slowly has gotten to a point where the two earths have split. Okay, and what's keeping those two earths together are these tethers. Okay, these are sort of portals, if you will, that allows us to go from one end to the other end as we're ascending into higher dimensions of fourth and fifth dimensional consciousness. When that last tether breaks, that's it. The last tether breaks, it creates a very seismic event, which some people are even now starting to pick up in terms of the 3 days of darkness. Okay, this is a seismic event that happens when those two earths happen. They create such a seismic wave of energy explosion that it's equivalent to 100,000 Hiroshima or hydrogen bombs. I mean, it's like an insane. It will have a ripple effect throughout the entire universe. Okay, but it causes a flash, and that when that flash happens, it's then followed by 3 days of darkness, and so this is all starting to happen. These are all things that are starting to be picked up and prophetically starting to happen. What happens then is that the new Earth moves on, it explodes. It doesn't explode. It actually shoots up into 5D, 6D. Okay, 5D is oneness. 5D is creation, where we have all these beautiful magical abilities to create with with our alchemistic mind. Okay, so all these things about dying or diseased or feeling hunger or even needing to barter anything. There's no monetary systems. There's no healthcare systems. There's no religious systems. There's none of that. You don't need that. It's heaven. It's close to as heaven as you can get until you get to 60, which is heaven on earth. The whole idea that you don't even have to exist in your body. All of these things are not just things that I'm coming up with. There are a lot of people that are now starting to piece the puzzles together, and there's civilizations that talked about this, and even Yeshua and others had little glimpses of that in the way that they taught. So that's what happens is the two earths split. The one earth splits and just kind of stays on this level track that ends. as I've been talking about in the year 2039, yes. It might end a little bit earlier. That one, not a pleasant scenario. That one is going to be very much of an Armageddon type of thing. I'm just going to be straight up, okay? Natural disasters, um, man-made wars, you name it, it all kind of mix it into a nice stew. It's going to just basically obliterate the human race. And there are a lot of conspiracies around this and who knows what and where. The fact of the matter is, it's more of like everybody knows it's going to happen. And the government, some governments know, and they're trying to prepare for it and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. It's all part of the process of how an earth school or any school gets cleaned out. It gets nice and tidied up. A lot of all the gunkiness goes away, and then down the road, about another 7 or 8 thousand years, a newer school comes. If you look at archaeologically how civilizations have been found, they come in sequences of about 10,000 years. A new civilization shows up, a new civilization shows. What happened to the previous one? It just kind of went away. We don't know exactly what it was. Maybe ice age, maybe this, maybe that. But that's the cycle. That's the cycle that this school goes through. So all of what I'm saying is actually stuff that all of the experiencers have been coded with. They just haven't gotten to a frequency yet that they've been able to articulate it maybe the way that I am, but there are many more that are talking about it. And as far as who goes and who doesn't, the vast majority of the people do move up to the fifth dimensional consciousness. There's a whole story around that, but by and large, just to keep everybody sane and not freaking out or anything, the overwhelming majority of the people do go. Okay, they do because by nature they're supposed to go. Okay, they do have to reach a level of consciousness to go. They're not just going to show up to the party one day and all of a sudden hop on a flight and all of a sudden they're in 5D. That's not how it works. Okay, they have to prove to themselves that they can go through this inner exploration of remembering who they are, so that they can prove to themselves that they can bring back with them contrast of fear, because that's only exists here on this planet. Okay, and if you want to take it to higher levels of consciousness, you got to master it here, because here is where you forget who you are. And if you could do it here, then you could take it with you. Okay, but not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody's going to sign up for that. And just like with any school, you're going to have some that will have to repeat the course. But that's about it. They'll have to repeat the course. That does mean that they have to go through 7 or 8 or 9 years of, you know, hell on earth, pretty much. And I don't want to exaggerate too much, but it's not going to be fun. But the vast overwhelming majority of them go on to the fifth dimension and experience heaven on earth, and extraordinary things that today would be called miracles, extraordinary things that the mind couldn't even begin to fathom could happen in the next 3 or 4 years. We're not talking decades here. We're talking years, which is also kind of extraordinary and also kind of risky from my part and other people's parts who are talking about these things, because, we're talking 3 to maybe at most, what would that be, 7 years or so. So I plan on being around. So I'm either going to have extraordinary amount of criticism for what I'm saying, or I'm going to be basically proven right. It doesn't really matter, right or wrong. It's just the way it is. And since I've been talking about it for over a year now, more and more people are coming out. My book is called the Closet Spiritualist, because it's about coming out. Even the spiritualist people who have been around doing this are starting to come out and say, oh, yeah, it's happening now. It's not happening 20 years from now or 100 years from now. It's happening now. And it's not going to last for 1,000 years. It's going to last for a handful of years. How many handfuls? Maybe about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years tops. That's it. So that's it. I don't know if I breathed at all at that time, but hopefully I didn't take all the oxygen out of the room, so to speak.
It was a lot to take in for sure. Just incredible. And I love that you're putting a time frame on it, because not everybody does that. They just want to say it's coming, it's coming. But who knows when? Could be in
Oh, yeah. It's
300 years. Yeah.
definitely here. It's definitely here.
Now,
It's definitely
is the frequency or vibration of the planet kind of rising up and helping us to
Yes.
realize, okay,
Yeah, I call it a symbiotic relationship with ourselves and with all of the sentientness of this planet. Mother Earth has a consciousness, and Mother Earth's consciousness is also right. It's a collective of consciousness that's rising up. This is causing people to have their remembrances or their awakenings. This is what's causing people to one day wake up and start, for no reason, start to ask these profound questions, or for no reason start to have these profound experiences. I call them STEs. They're spiritually transformative experiences, which are just as impactful as NDEs. They just don't have to necessarily literally die to experience it. And the purest NDE, if you will, are the ones who actually have the experience and come back and remember them. But there are a lot of people that have had NDEs who have died, say they don't remember, and then are now starting to remember. It's the experience that you remember is the key, and all of those things are happening as consciousness rises on the planet and collectively. No, that doesn't even get into the whole discussion about parallel realities, multiverses, and multi-dimensions. So we'll just leave that for another time.
I might have to have you on again. Um, so we're not just left out there to dry. We are being guided. It's not anything anybody has to have fear over being left behind.
No, it isn't. I mean, there are people here who are here to do this. I mean, there are a number of people that are here to guide the human race forward. Okay. Um, in my case, I talk about this in some instances, but in my case, I was a walk-in, okay, which means that at the time that I had this near-death experience, the spiritual being that was in my body chose to stay, and I don't blame him. Okay, it was a blissful experience. In that moment, there was an exchange of spiritual entities of consciousness, and I came back in the body of this child. And and assume the child's life. And now, how do I know that I'm a walk-in? There's no scientific empirical evidence to show. There's no clinical studies or trials, and you're never going to get any of that. I know that I was a walk-in because my whole entire life I felt like I didn't fit in this earth suit. Not because I didn't just fit in it because it was an earth suit, but I felt like I was, from a genetic disposition, I felt like I wasn't lining up correctly with it. Like there was something slightly off in the fitting. And then you add to that sort of one of the things that I knew that from a very early age, I knew I had access to an extraordinary amount of information through the Akashic records, and I saw what I was in my spiritual life. In terms of, I had visions in terms of myself preparing for coming here and what I was supposed to do. So all sorts of things. The walk-in phenomenon is becoming more common. Okay, a couple of years ago, nobody talked about it. Okay, I mean, it was very like rare. Okay, the walk-in phenomenon is just the exchange of souls. Okay, everybody who's had a walk-in, or if somebody didn't have a walk-in, that they didn't have this sort of plan or vision or mission to do anything to help guide the human race. Being a walk-in doesn't give you extra rights or privileges or anything different. It just is the way I came in. Happened to have I just happened to see this, beautiful Lamborghini was sitting there. It was 6 months old, and I wanted to jump in, and it was still there, right? I mean, it still had a lot of life left in it. It barely had any miles on it. So I came in that way. But a lot of people who are here to assist humanity are here, and they've done it just the old-fashioned way. They just came in at the time of birth, okay? But there are a significant number. I call them the dimensionals. You probably have talked to people who have all sorts of relationships with all of the Arcturians and Mantises and Palladians and all what they would call the galactic beings. I call them dimensionals because I know that they come from various dimensions that are above the third dimension. Okay, so there are those that are working mostly behind the scenes to help humanity get prepared for this time, in all sorts of ways. They maintain they, believe it or not, they maintain the bodies while we're in our sleep states. They get the bodies prepared for this evolution from carbon based to crystalline based, so that all these genetic codes, the 95% of the DNA that our body has, that science refers to as junk, which nothing is junk, is going to get activated. And when it gets activated, that's when I was telling you the body's going to do all these extraordinary things. Okay. So they do a lot of that kind of stuff. And then you get the higher dimensionals, which are the ones that help prepare the school, actually build the school. Then you have what I call the angelics, which is what I am, and that is what we didn't go through the evolutionary process of going through the dimensions. We were born out of source, and source is a different level of consciousness way beyond the higher self. And the higher self in and of itself is also an extraordinary group of consciousness, because it's in the higher self that all of these things called the multi-dimensions, the parallel realities, the multiverses, portals, stargates, all of that stuff, you name it, all of that stuff exists inside the higher self. And so that alone is monstrous. Okay. So those all these beings, from as that you've heard maybe some talk about how all of these beings are, how the whole universe is looking at this whole situation right now with bated breath, and excitement for it. That they're not joking. Everybody's at this party right now. Everybody's at this party because the party has started. The party has started. It's not going to be one of those all night bingers that people, not that I would know what that is, but they're all night bingers that go on for months, okay, or years, or decades, or hundreds of years, or millennia. The party has started, and in a sense, the clock has started to tick downward. So there's a lot of assistance happening here for people, but they have to start going inward to tap into that assistance. They doing it the old traditional way of outward expressions, or please, please prayers and all that, to the outerness of something that doesn't really exist. That's literally like shouting at the rain. You're using the wrong channels to get there. Not to say they don't get support. That's not what I mean, but I'm just saying there's a direct access, and that direct access is through you. So if you do that and you start to go inward to get the answers, listen to your intuition, listen to your voice, listen to your gut feelings. Those are all communications that are coming through the higher self, the collective. If you start to do that, your world is going to change pretty fast.
You mentioned that you had a book. How can my viewers find your book or find you if they have questions or they need more information?
So my first book is called The Closet Spiritualist, and it's on Amazon, it's in Barnes and Noble. But the easiest way for everybody to kind of just get all the information they like in terms of what I'm doing, the teachings, the course that I teach, which is the Way of the Inner Child, the upcoming book that's coming up, all of that, they just can go on my website, and it's the 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 closetspiritualist.com. And I have to stress the part because somebody already beat me out to the closetspiritualist.com. So I have to make sure, put that the in there, theclosetspiritualist.com. And it's a real simple website to navigate, but it tells you everything that I'm doing. And if you're interested in wanting to have a consult or become a student, and because people can acquire these gifts. These are not just gifts that we've been given randomly to people with NDEs or STEs or whatever. um, Everybody has them, and you're going to get them one way or another. So I teach students how to access those now, and it's been profound for many of them. So you want all that, you just go to that site. If you want to know about I also have a nutrition company that I've created around the nutrition of body, mind, soul. So that's there too. So
Wonderful. If you had one message you wanted the audience to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
well, I jokingly tell people nowadays, there's just two words that I would say about all of this. And so it's not something that I create. Obviously, you wouldn't know it's there, but I tell people, let's go, let's go. It's time. It's time. Party has begun. You know, there's no more having to search. There's no more seeking here. Okay. Rumi said something that apparently I sort of say something similar to it. And that is that, Rumi said something like, that which you are seeking is seeking you. And I've been telling people this for some time now, that we've been spending our entire lives looking for answers out there, okay, hoping and praying that someday those answers would be answered through some sort of phenomenon, chariots coming out of the clouds, angels with diapers on blowing horns and whistles and all that. Or maybe if not all that, maybe some UFO action something, something to give us a sense that there's something extraordinary out there. And though some of that is actually going to happen, some of that will happen, especially on the UFO stuff, okay? All we have to do is realize that look at the mirror, okay? If you want to know what God looks like, you're staring at it, okay? If you want to know what you've been waiting for, you've been waiting for yourself. You've been waiting for yourself to remember who you are. That's all it is. And Rumi said it hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but it still applies today. That which you are seeking is seeking you. You have been waiting for yourself to wake up and remember who you are, the divine being. And now the party started. So let's go. Let's go. That's my parting words.
I love
Mm.
that. Beautiful parting words. Thank you, Franco, so much for being my guest today. This was amazing and very enlightening for me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here and supporting my channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing if you enjoy near death experiences and other spiritually transformative stories. It helps the algorithm know that this information is useful and push it out to more people. And that's the goal, to get as many people to know that we are eternal spiritual beings and that we never die. Our bodies might die, but our essence will never die. And I want people to live with less fear. Let's all spread the word. Like, comment, subscribe, share, hit that little notification bell so you get all the notifications when my videos post. Thank you for all of your support. I'm sending love to you.